Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the fourth event of the Opening Doors, Embracing Diversity in National Security series. My name is Catrina Doxsee, and I'm a Program Manager and Research Associate with the International Security Program's Transnational Threats Project here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So the Opening Doors series is part of the International Security Program's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Action Plan. We will be hosting these quarterly events with members of ISP's young professional staff who will discuss career paths, mentoring, and networking advice, as well as how DEI issues have impacted them. Today's event features my colleague, Grace Hwang. She is a program coordinator and research assistant with the Emeritus Chair in Strategy, as well as working with me in the Transnational Threats Project. Grace holds a bachelor's degree in international relations and Russian from Bucknell University. So before we get started with the event, I just want to run through the schedule. We will begin with about 30 minutes of conversation. During the conversation, I recommend that audience members submit questions using the link on our website. We will answer all of your questions in the remaining time. So Grace, I'm looking forward to our discussion. Can we start with just a brief introduction about your roles here at CSIS and an overview of your career path so far?
Sure, Katrina. Well, I'm happy to be here, and thank you so much for moderating today's discussion. Before we begin, I do want to give a very big thank you to the Smart Women and Smart Power Project, as well as our broadcasting team here at CSIS, who made today possible, as well as organized this whole event. So I really hope that today can be more of a discussion between the two of us. Of course, we work together, so we already have discussions on everything from current events to data sets, and I dare say that we would make a pretty good podcast. But for our audience tuning in today, I really do hope that our conversation can offer an insight into our career path, as well as why we think diversity is important in the field. So I'll begin with my role here at CSIS, where I support two programs. The Emeritus Chair in Strategy is run by Dr. Anthony Cortesman, and I support him on research involving current U.S. force posture, as well as the future of competition. With the Transnational Threats Project, I support a team led by Dr. Seth Jones, and we do research on everything concerning international and domestic terrorism, as well as irregular warfare with countries like Russia, China, and Iran. So this sounds like a very long list of topics, so I'll briefly go into my career path so far that has led me to CSIS. As Katrina mentioned, I graduated from Bucknell University with a double major in Russian and international relations. It was during my undergrad program that I was able to really hone in on my interests, as well as what I didn't see as a potential career trajectory. During my sophomore year, I interned at a human rights NGO in Moscow, Russia, and the organization did really amazing work. However, I came to the realization that if I wanted to stay in the space, as well as make some impact, I might have to work in the nonprofit realm living in Russia. So I really took a step back and realized that what I wanted to work in was US policy, and specifically US policy that didn't only involve human rights, but also had reverberating effects on diplomacy and the economy. So that's when I really took a pivot and I turned my sights to national security. It was there that I interned at various think tanks that focused on defense policy. Now, during this time, I came in with a very specific focus on US-Russian relations, but it was my work experience that really broadened my area of expertise. I came to the realization that many aspects within national security are rather interconnected. So US relations with Russia and competition with Russia is largely impacted by Middle East force deployments. And our US Middle East force deployments were largely in response to terrorism following 9/11 and the rise of the Islamic State. And so as my area of interest evolved, I found myself at an internship at CSIS. From there, that internship became a part-time position, and then it became a full-time position. So that's a brief career about my career, a brief summary of my career. And one thing that's become apparent to me is that within national security, it's very rare that someone has a linear career trajectory. It's more common that people come from a diverse set of experiences before they enter the field, or at the very least, no career path is unique. So, Catrina, I hope that today we can have a discussion, and I would love to hear more about your insights and your career path as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk through a little bit of my background as well. And as Grace mentioned, not all careers are entirely linear. And, you know, I think that mine is definitely a bit more in that category of not being as linear. So I actually, when I started college, I began college as a physics major, and I was going to study physics. Now, as we mentioned at the beginning, I'm now working at CSIS in the Transnational Threats Project. So like Grace, I'm working on issues of counterterrorism, irregular warfare, most recently on domestic terrorism and Russian use of private military companies, which, as you'll notice, is very much not physics. I got midway through my undergrad time and just realized that the classes that I was much more interested in and engaged with and really wanted to do for the rest of my life were my classes on history and political science. And in particular, I had a class that was on insurgency, terrorism, and civil war that I sat in that class and I thought to myself, this is what I want to do. You know, I want to be able to work with these issues, figure out these puzzles, and do this kind of work with my career. And so that was kind of my aha moment in college that this is what I wanted to do. And yet the path here has not been entirely linear. So in college, I had worked a number of work study jobs focused largely on educational nonprofits because there were opportunities that were available on my campus. And, you know, even though it wasn't the area I was studying and working in, I was really passionate about educational equity. Coming out of college, there weren't a lot of opportunities to really work directly in national security. I had a really hard time trying to get into the Washington bubble, as we call it. And so I started to look for other ways that I could still develop some of the knowledge and the skills that would ultimately be useful in a national security career, especially when focused on asymmetrical warfare. So I served for 2 terms in AmeriCorps in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I was specifically working as a refugee caseworker at a refugee resettlement agency. So I was working with people arriving to the United States primarily in their first 3 months in the country who had come as refugees. And so I kind of, I approached this as a really important experience for me, knowing I wanted to work in policy on counterterrorism and on irregular warfare, to be able to understand the human side of those conflicts, to understand the people whose lives were uprooted by these types of conflicts rather than just, you know, ultimately seeing them as numbers on a spreadsheet. And that was a really impactful experience for me. I met a lot of fantastic people, both the clients I was working with and my coworkers, but it also really solidified for me that longer term, I wanted to be able to work more on the policy side rather than on the direct social service side. So coming out of that experience, I went to grad school. I went to Johns Hopkins CSIS, the School of Advanced International Studies, doing a year in Bologna, Italy, and then a year in DC. And so at CSIS, I was studying strategic studies as well as international economics. I also, in addition to my coursework and being involved in department activities at CSIS, I did an internship at the Treasury Department in the Middle East and North Africa office. And I also worked as a research assistant to one of my professors. And so I was kind of adjusting to be a little bit more on track to do policy work. Coming out of grad school, of course, in the midst of a hiring freeze, as luck will always have it, I got a job at another think tank here in DC, one that was specifically focused on immigration and migration issues. So this leveraged some of my past experiences, particularly on the refugee resettlement side, but I was working on education policy rather than on international relations directly. So this was looking at education policies to support immigrants and refugees when they arrive in the United States to be able to integrate and have success, which is an extremely important topic, but not the one that I had really studied to be able to advance that I wanted to work in long term. I wanted to work more at the root of the conflicts that were causing large amounts of human displacement instead. And so I continued to get involved in other professional development opportunities. Actually, right as I was beginning that job, I did a program that was jointly offered through Brookhaven National Laboratory and the IAEA on nuclear security. I also continued to just explore professional development opportunities in my free time, and ultimately was able to get the job at CSIS with the Transnational Threats Project. And so I've loved my time working here so far. I love the issues we get to work on. I've also continued to keep my ears open for other professional opportunities that I can do in my free time, which I have little of. So in addition to my work here at TNT, I also am on the editorial board for the Irregular Warfare Initiative, which is a joint effort of the Modern War Institute at West Point and Princeton ESOC. I'm also, along with Grace, a member and one of the team helping to start up the Women's Wargaming Network. And I am the 2021 Counterterrorism Fellow at Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. So I have continued to just, add really cool experiences on, and I feel like I'm really starting to dig into the field that I want to be working on long term, which has been really exciting. I should note, I realized as I was, reviewing my own resume and planning out these remarks that it sounds like I've done a lot of things. It sounds really coherent in hindsight. But a point that I do want to bring up, and that I think we'll come back to a few times in this conversation, is just the fact that when you're living it, you don't necessarily always have an exact plan of what the next step is, how things are going to connect together. It is only in hindsight that you get that coherency. And so as you're navigating, if you are in those earlier stages of your career, just because it feels like you don't have the coherent, next steps planned out for the next 10 years, that's certainly how I felt the whole way along. I don't know, Grace, if that's been your experience too, but definitely don't be intimidated by other people's bios that seem to be much more coherently strung together as a series of well-planned steps, because at least in my experience, they certainly have not been planned from the start.
Absolutely. I think that's great advice, Catrina. And I have a saying that I personally don't have a 10-year plan, and I don't trust people with a 10-year plan, just for the reason that life is unpredictable, your interests evolve, and inevitably you won't really know where you will be in those 10 years. But short-term goals are definitely possible.
Yeah. So thinking through the steps of the career path that you talked about, Grace, you've had multiple internships. Do you think that having internships like those are necessary to be able to break into the field?
Now, I certainly don't think internships are the only way to break into the field, but I do believe it is the most common method. Internships are widely available. They're usually on a semester basis where you can work with an organization between 3 to 6 months. And it's a great way for you to get accustomed to the organization, their work, and how it fits into your interests. And likewise, it's a great way for the organization to get to know you, as well as make relationships that are going to be meaningful in your DC network connections later on in your career. Now, I do want to highlight that a lot of internships available in DC do not pay their interns. And for some, that really is unrealistic. The cost of living in DC is quite expensive. And so it's just not a possibility that many can take on. So for those of you looking for internships, I really do recommend looking at national fellowships that are available, as well as scholarships that your schools provide. I will say one good thing that came out of this pandemic is that many internships became virtual. We discovered that it was possible. And so in the future, I do hope that we can keep these virtual internships and we can broaden our applicant pool. But on that note, comparing our careers, Catrina, it seems that you have had a wide variety of positions. And I do appreciate that. But I will say I would like to know more about how you navigated that, as well as, how did you use those different positions and experiences and other topics to be prepared for this current position that you're in?
Absolutely. So I think actually I'll go back to the best piece of advice that I was given in grad school by a career advisor, who said that when you're trying to break into a field for the first time, or if you're trying to change career paths, one of the best things you can do is to plan out halfway steps. And so what she meant by this was that, you have a sense of where you want to go, what you want to be working in. So throughout many of the earlier stages of my career that I talked about, I knew that I wanted to be working in international security. I hoped to be able to work on the issues I'm working on now, on counterterrorism, on asymmetrical warfare. But I did not have the experience to be able to just come in and take a position like the one I'm in now. I didn't have connections in DC. I hadn't lived in DC when I was first applying to positions here. I was, as Grace mentioned, kind of doing the shuffle to try to find a paid internship. And I am so glad that CSIS does offer paid internships. I'm really proud of that. But the halfway step is really about thinking about the skills that you need to get to the full step that you're looking for. And so, for example, when I was coming out of grad school, I had academic experience thinking about policy analysis, briefings, research, and I had the professional experience of having served in AmeriCorps and worked in refugee resettlement. And so using that, although my sort of longer term full step goal was to be working at a place like CSIS on irregular warfare, my quote unquote half step was to instead work on policy related to immigration and refugee services. And so that was my chance to get the professional experience doing all of the tasks that I'm still doing now at CSIS in a research institution, being able to network with stakeholders, to do professional research, to write and publish reports and briefs, but doing it on a topic that I had more demonstrated professional experience in. And so if you can think of ways like that to seek opportunities that will give you the skills that you need to get where you ultimately want to go, that'll give you that half step to be more competitive when you go for that full step. I think especially early on in your career, one of the most important things is to continue thinking about those skills that you have rather than the tasks that you've done, right? So before I came to CSIS, I had a lot of experience in a think tank, writing, doing research, planning events, networking with stakeholders, briefing stakeholders, but it was on a completely different subject matter. But I still had those tangible skills. And especially if you're earlier on, if you haven't worked in any research settings in any places in DC, still think about the skills that you've used. So when I think back to early on in my career, it's easy to think about the experience you had at a place. So when I think back to working at Kmart when I was younger, the first thing that comes to mind is, being overwhelmed by the fact that there were 10 songs on repeat during the holiday season, just 10 songs on repeat all the time. But when I'm actually marketing that experience, the thing I would want to actually emphasize is the customer service, working under pressure, especially during holiday season. When I think back to working on a farm, I think about having to wrangle goats that escaped from the petting zoo pen. But that's the thing I did. That's not the skill I developed. The skill is, again, that customer service, managing money, managing a team of people who are working together, getting things done on a clear schedule. All of these different responsibilities that you have and skills you develop can be applied in all sorts of contexts, even if you're not working immediately in the sort of research setting that you might want to be in long term. So.
And I would just like to comment that every day, whether it's meeting with donors, making sure budgets are on time, and organizing our team, Catrina has done a very good job of what some might call trying to herd cats. So the experience definitely does have an implication in your current position.
Definitely. But so Grace, with the experiences that you've had so far, why have you decided to remain working in a think tank?
Well, that's a great question because once I entered the think tank realm, I really did not leave. And that's because I identified quite a few things that I really enjoyed that I thought were unique to the think tank realm. So the first one is that purely I enjoyed the research. And the other things that I really did enjoy were getting the ability to publish at a much faster rate than is usually afforded to a field like academia. Another thing that I very much enjoyed is seeing that policy that our work influenced. Not all change is tangible, not all change is rapid, but knowing that the research and the data you did contributed to a policy looking at something like Russian PMCs, where the open source data in the unclassified realm was rather lacking, it's extremely satisfying. So that's why I stayed in the think tank realm, and truly I'm so grateful to be at CSIS because we are doing unbiased work based on objective data. There is no political bias. We produce products that we can stand by. So those are some of the big reasons that I stayed in the think tank realm. And while these were the reasons that I decided to stay, Catrina, what has been the most satisfying part for you working in research?
Yeah, I think you absolutely nailed it with the last part of what you said. It's having that impact and knowing that the analysis that we're doing is actually, landing on the desks of policymakers. It's having an impact on how decision makers address some of the most pressing issues that our country is facing. I've seen this especially with our recent work on domestic terrorism, as we see an increase in terrorist attacks and plots in the United States. Being able to really dig in and compile objective data to be able to analyze what those trends are, what they mean, what the government can do to respond to them. It's been just really impactful to see that impact, whether it's having that data shared with or briefed to government leaders, seeing it reflected in things coming out from the administration, the work that we did on our team. So obviously a big kudos to Grace on this as well. Was cited in a front page article in the Washington Post, which is extremely cool. Getting a push notification on your phone from the Washington Post for research that you contributed to is an extremely cool feeling that I never expected that I would be able to have. And I think moreover, just knowing that that research is going to actually improving people's lives and to actually improving the security of the country is just really huge to me. I think it really gives the work that we're doing meaning. So I'm curious though, Grace, just going back to when you walked us through the series of experiences you've had, you also described a bit of the evolution of your interests. So I wondered if you could just expand on that a bit, how your interests have grown over time, how they've gotten maybe more specific or more broad.
Sure. Well, there is a debate among our community on the merits of being a quote unquote generalist or a quote unquote specialist. And like I mentioned, I really thought I was going to be a specialist in US-Russian relations. But I think my biggest advice for the audience, speaking in broad terms, is that if there is a topic that you are truly passionate about, then you should pursue it. Really invest in expanding that depth of knowledge. On the other hand, if you're just broadly interested in national security or the topic at large, there are many advantages as well to increasing your width of knowledge. It just depends on the kind of policy that you want to work on and what interests you. So this sounds like a cliche, forgive me, but I do find it to be true, is that throughout your career, you should maintain an ongoing passion for learning. Because in many ways, so a hot take moment from me, or perhaps maybe a lukewarm moment because there are some shared sentiments on this. It's very hard for one to ever achieve that status of a quote unquote expert, especially if you are always tracking a topic that is constantly evolving. So if you are interested in something, always be passionate to learn more about it. Be interested in learning about the topics around it, and I really don't think that could steer you wrong. So that's my general advice. But more broadly, international security and international relations, it is a huge and complex field. So, Catrina, maybe you have some more specific advice that you would give someone early in their career that's trying to figure out where they would have the most success or impact.
Well, first, I would absolutely second your point about just lifelong learning. Continue to read, continue to listen, whether it's podcasts, events, especially with the number of events and speaker series that are online now, and hopefully will remain more accessible following the pandemic, because you can't hone down your interests until you really explore what's out there. I think one of the things that's been most striking to me, especially in seeing some of the work even that our colleagues are doing here at CSIS on issues such as tech, AI, intelligence. These are things that, back in 2009, when I was starting to go into college, I didn't even know these things existed as a subset of national security. So things are always going to evolve. And I think it's also the sort of thing where you can't anticipate what topics and what areas are going to become the hot button issues, and you're not going to have a satisfying career if you just try to chase what you think is going to be the next big issue. And so just try things, find out what you like, find out what you're interested in, what projects do you work on, and when it's done, you think, oh, I'm so disappointed I'm done working on this because I have so many other questions I want to follow up on. Find those things that make you excited to go to work in the morning. And along the way, if you try things, if you have an internship or a job working on something that you really dislike, that's fine. In some ways, that's just as helpful or even more helpful to narrow down what you don't want to do as it is to figure out what you do want to do. And I think it's also something you don't need a concrete answer for. I think people continue to be open to new opportunities as they progress in their careers. You continue to learn new things, find new questions that you want to explore. And so I guess to some extent, you just have to throw yourself in there and start trying things out and see what really captures your attention. So we've talked a lot just so far about the experiences we've had in terms of concrete work experience, thinking about our position in the field. But unfortunately, the field of international security and policy more broadly does face a lot of challenges and barriers, including as pertaining to diversity. So Grace, I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about some of the barriers you faced when you first entered the field, or any barriers that you continue to face.
Absolutely. And that's why we're here today, to have an honest conversation. So as much as I enjoy the work that I do, I also can't ignore that there is an uncomfortable truth that exists within the space, and that is that there is a certain degree of stigma that exists. So I think I could best illustrate this with stories that I've experienced. So when I first entered the national security field, there was an assumption that I would be a regional expert. Now, not a Russian regional expert, but an Asian affairs regional expert. And that was largely in part because of my upbringing. Now, I want to make it very clear, I'm very proud to be a first-generation Korean American. But when people actually ask me, where are you from? My first instinct is to respond, I'm from the great state of Maryland. And that's really because at the end of the day, I was born in the US. I first and foremost consider myself an American, and I know I have the analytical capabilities to understand the cultural nuances of any region, not just one where my parents have grown up in. And so This, to me, is an indicator that the field does need to experience some kind of change. And I think we need to start by addressing our own internal biases. And these biases lead us to these kinds of conclusions, which at the end of the day, they're ultimately stereotypes. And stereotypes are very limiting within the national security field. One other issue that I faced as an incoming national security analyst was that I lacked a background, a military experience background. So I do recognize that I have a lot to learn from actual battlefield combat, and that is very important when we do the kind of research and analysis. But what I also recognize is that I do offer a unique perspective, and that can come from my cultural knowledge as well as the time I spent in Russia. So another kind of analogy to help you understand this is understanding strategic competition with Russia. So many people liken competition with Russia to a game of chess. So let's go with that analogy. If we are playing chess with Russia, but we are only playing it with a US-centric point of view based on conventional military strength, well, we might as well be playing checkers with Russia because they have a completely different perspective and they have a completely different set of rules. And so more broadly, this is why diversity is so important in the national security field. It offers new perspectives, and at the end of the day, it makes your analysis stronger, it makes your understanding stronger. And that is why I think we should bring in more perspectives in the field.
Could you talk a little bit more about what you think is causing these barriers?
Sure. So I don't have the answer, but I can guess a few. One, I think it's caused in part because of how competitive the space is, and that's very limiting to those trying to break into the field. But more bluntly, it's also because we haven't achieved an acceptable level of diversity. And when I refer to diversity, I really am referring to the whole range, including racial diversity, gender diversity, socioeconomic diversity. And again, let me illustrate this in an example. So within DC, I'll admit to a certain extent there is degree inflation. You have an influx of very qualified applicants who are all applying for the same position with those who only have undergraduate degrees. While the majority of them do have a master's or even a PhD. And at the end of the day, this inadvertently creates disadvantages for people who either A, weren't able to get a master's degree, or maybe they weren't even able to finish their bachelor's degree because one example could be a financial issue. And so this helps us to recognize that we currently have a system that is limiting to certain demographics. And that's something that we need to change if we do want to open the pipeline up for diversity and national security.
And can you speak a little bit more about how you think we can open that pipeline and just continue combating the obstacles that are standing in the way of better diversity?
Of course. I would love to have the answers to everything, but I don't. For me, however, there are two big steps that I think we should all take. That first step is I think we all need to identify where we lack in diversity, either within our team, within our program, within the organization. And a lot of times that is usually a very uncomfortable process where we look at the causal factors, and many of the times we have to internally reflect on our role. So we have to question ourselves. Why do we subconsciously, or sometimes why do we even consciously favor one demographic or over another for a certain position? And so once we identify that, the next step is to try to remove these barriers. And like I said, I don't have the answers to everything, but two big areas I definitely flag are one crucial need that think tanks really should pay their interns. It's very limiting to those who can't live in DC and work as an unpaid intern. Additionally, I really do think we should full-time offer virtual internships, and that's really going to allow people all across the United States as well as globally to apply for positions that they otherwise wouldn't have. And so these are just some of the insights that I have. Catrina, I'd love to hear what your observations were. Specifically, we've discussed this before. What are some of the power dynamics that you've seen or experienced in the field, and what mindset do we need to navigate them? So more importantly, us in the field can reduce these barriers and improve diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's no secret to any of us that the international security and foreign relations field is very heavily dominated by white, straight men who are typically from affluent backgrounds, very little representation of anyone who is gender nonconforming, anyone who's neurodivergent. I know we have some questions in the chat about kind of how we should think about different identities fitting into this broad landscape of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that one of the big issues that I've seen in DC is that there's this pressure to just sort of assimilate into, I don't want to use the term the blob because that has all sorts of other debate and connotation associated with it, but there's this pressure to blend in, to prove that you can just fit in with the people who have traditionally been leaders in the field and been able to access the field. And I think that that really drowns out the fact that, you know, as we get more fresh voices at the table, we're able to bring a lot of new perspectives, new ways of thinking about things. And so whether that's coming in with increased gender diversity, representation of the LGBTQ community, more racial and ethnic diversity, more neurodiversity, I think that that presents us with more voices at the table who can see issues in new ways, who have different lived experiences, who understand the impacts of policy, who understand concerns that other people may not even think of in the first place. And so I think one of the big things we can do as individuals is just to, number one, make those people welcome. Some of it's obviously at the institutional level, but even as individuals, you know, if you're involved in the hiring process, confront your own biases and figure out how you can have a genuine hiring process that gives everyone equal opportunity to have these positions. Our diversity staff at CSIS has this great phrase about looking for culture adds instead of culture fits. Who can, you know, excel in the requirements of a job while also adding new perspective, new lived experiences that will ultimately push you to create a better product, and especially when you're working in national or international security, ultimately make us all safer. And if we're cutting out those perspectives just because they don't look like us or they don't think like us, they haven't had the same lived experiences as us, they don't adhere to the same socioeconomic norms as us, any of those things, we're missing out on the kind of thinking that could lead to major innovations in this space. And so now, just conscious of the time, I do know we have a number of questions here. And so kind of off of this topic as well, Tyler has asked, how do we see implementation of DEI initiatives more in the K-12 setting, ultimately making the talent pool of national security professionals more diverse and broader and making the field more welcoming? Grace, do you have any thoughts on that? How, you know, we've talked a lot about how we can improve diversity sort of at the professional level, but how can initiatives to improve diversity earlier on also help to solve this problem?
Absolutely. Well, I think it is important to address these when we're starting this applicant pool from a very early age, because it gives people an equal opportunity to have those lived experiences. Catrina, I love the way you say it, whether it's going to a certain college, whether it's getting the experience to work at an internship, because in middle school, perhaps you were introduced to the subject in the first place. So all of these things really do have a ripple effect. And I think that's a big reason that we need to open our ability to make this field diverse, starting from education and school and giving everyone that equal opportunity. And Catrina, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, from my own personal experience, when I was growing up, I talked earlier about not knowing that certain branches of national security existed. When I was younger, when I was in the K-12 school system, I don't think I even really understood that national security was a career path you could go on. I knew that you could, go be president or be in Congress and be a politician. But the sort of work I'm doing now, I didn't even know that that existed. And that's largely because it wasn't represented in my daily life. It wasn't made available to me as an option in school. History class was about memorizing dates or things like that throughout a lot of elementary school. It's about making a vision of what you can be possible, and hopefully also showing you people who look or have lived experiences like you who are doing those jobs. Now we have another question that I want to take a first stab at from Claire, who asks how we deal with the disappointment of getting rejected and how we can learn from those experiences. And I love this question because I think, especially when you're starting out in your career, there's something so isolating about applying for jobs. And there's something so isolating about getting rejection after rejection. And you start to feel like everyone who's working in this field figured it out somehow. They got these jobs. And each of those rejections can, be a huge disappointment. And I think it's okay to let yourself feel that. But I think kind of the mindset you need to put yourself in if you're getting rejected is just understanding that unfortunately that's how it works. It's a bit of a crapshoot to get some of those first jobs in DC. One of the things that actually really stood out to me at CSIS early on in the pandemic, we started doing internal brown bags where we had some of our more senior staff members talking particularly with junior staff in mind about their career paths. And it was amazing to me how many of my colleagues who I have enormous respect for, who have accomplished incredible things in their careers, talked about how early on, soon after college, early in their careers, they were working some minimum wage job and kind of despairing that they had made a mistake and why were they even in this field. And I was able to listen to that and think like, yes, that's what I just went through too, coming into this. It's not, everyone goes through lots of rejections. When you think about people's career paths, it's that same thing we talk about with social media, right? The Instagram effect, that the career bio or resume you might see from someone is all of the good, shiny experiences that they want to promote, the things that have been successes. But everyone has failures too. Everyone gets rejected. And I guess it's not a good answer in that it's not kind of a solution, but I think that, taking those resumes and cover letters, having trusted friends, or, if you're still in school, the career office or a trusted professor who knows things about the field, look over them, give you advice for improving them. If you have friends who you've worked with in the past coworkers or bosses who could look it over, and I think other people are always better at hyping you up and telling you to brag about yourself than you might feel comfortable being on those materials. I think it's sometimes a slog to just keep applying to so many things and get those rejections, but it's worth it because the more you apply, the closer the day is when you finally get that yes. So. Grace, I know we have just a minute left. I don't know if you had anything else on that. Otherwise, I do have a closing question for us.
Well, Claire, thank you so much for that question, because Lord knows I've experienced many rejections to all these applications. Fun story, I grew up in the DC area. I was aware of CSIS in high school. I applied multiple times as a high schooler thinking I could get in, got multiple rejections, and then following, when I did have actual work experience, still got rejected a couple of times too before I finally got this internship. I do just want to highlight that just because you get a rejection doesn't mean that you're not qualified or doesn't mean you're not a right fit. A lot of times it's about timing, it's about who they have available. And so please don't let that be a representation to you in your quality of work. But Catrina, absolutely, ask the last question away.
Yes, so this is something of an ISP tradition for a lot of our internal meetings as well, just so that we can end on more of an optimistic note. Grace, what makes you hopeful for the future of the international security field?
That's a great question. To be very honest, many things in the world make me a pessimist, but many things also make me hopeful. I would really like to thank all of my mentors and colleagues that I've run into during my career. It's their graciousness and their selflessness to help that has really made me hopeful that this community is a place that can be welcoming and a place that can experience change. And then I am really hopeful for those that I see coming into the field. Not only are you all intelligent, but you're inquisitive. You challenge the status quo. And that makes me hopeful that whatever system we have right now has the ability to improve. So a little bit cheesy, but it does help me sleep at night. Catrina, can I ask what makes you hopeful as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think similarly, I'm really hopeful by all of the bright young people who are coming into this field, but also by just this recent acknowledgement that we need more diversity, that we need better inclusive processes in the field, that the field needs to be more welcoming to people. We have a large number of affinity organizations across DC and across the country and the globe to help to promote diversity, but also more importantly, to let you know that you're not alone. I think there's something that can be really isolating when you're first applying for jobs, when you're first trying to break into the field, especially, you know, as we're saying, as you're going through that slog of sending in so many hundreds of applications before you get an acceptance, especially when you're coming from you know, identifying with some kind of minority or marginalized group that you don't see represented in the organizations you're applying for or in the government. I think that there's something that can be very lonely about that. And I'm really excited about the fact that I think the field is working really hard to, you know, get rid of that dynamic, to build up these organizations that can draw people together, that can connect you with people who are like-minded, but also to really build up allies in the field, because it's not just about finding, you know, the role models who are just like you. It's about finding the role models who've had very different experiences, but are still empathetic and open to hearing about your thoughts, your interests, your experiences, and figuring out how best to help you move forward. And so I'm, you know, again, thank you to our CSIS colleagues for letting us have this discussion. I am grateful that CSIS is one of these organizations that's really putting this at the forefront of the conversation. And I think overall, you know, we need to continue having these conversations. We need to continue to push ourselves to be more welcoming and to push the field as a whole to bring on all of the incredible talent that I see, you know, on this webinar and in general trying to break into the field. So we need to make room and continue to build up. So thank you again for all joining us today. And we hope to see you at future CSIS events and perhaps at other events in DC. So have a good day, everyone.
Thank you all for joining.